Alrighty, hello ladies, and welcome to our speciation note video part 1. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what speciation is, the different kinds of speciation, and a few other topics, but this note video will continue into part 2 and even potentially a part 3. So the first thing that you should know is that Charles Darwin proposed this idea that all living things are descended from an ancient common ancestor. And if you remember, we were doing phylogenetic trees and talking about how things come from other things and common ancestors. And Darwin proposed that everything comes from the same common ancestors. So on a large scale, evolution is the descent of different species from a common ancestor over many generations. And this takes a very, very long time. Evolution does not happen overnight. It takes hundreds of years. So before we get into speciation, we really need to make sure we understand what a species is. And the biological species concept, or BSC, was proposed by Ernest Mayr, and it might be pronounced Mayer. Honestly, I'm not sure. But he explains the fact that two organisms, in order for them to be separate species, they often have to be reproductively isolated, which means that they're not able to reproduce viable offspring. Reproductive isolation, here's the definition, means that two organisms either do not interbreed or they do not produce fertile offspring as a result of interbreeding. So speciation refers to the event in which two or more separate species may arise. And remember when we were doing phylogenetic trees in Unit 2, those branch points are points where speciation occurs. A new species comes to be. So there are other types of isolation. We have reproductive isolation, and then we have behavioral isolation. And that is the separation of two populations when they develop these differences in how they attract mates. So think about courtship dances, songs, things that birds do. Their coloration often can be a thing that different species have in order to attract mates, and also pheromones. So there are other types of isolation. And these are specific to reproductive isolation. So these three things are examples of reproductive isolation. There's mechanical isolation, where there's an atomical difference between the two species that cause breeding or pollination to not occur. There is gametic isolation, which is when the eggs and the sperm can't chemically combine in order to make a zygote or an offspring. And then there's post-zygotic isolation. So this is when zygotes or new offspring form, but they die, or they have some type of hybrid that's born that's infertile or might have a lowered fertility. So think of ligers. Tigers and lions can technically reproduce. They have the ability to do that and produce another basically species, but that species is infertile. Ligers are not able to produce their own offspring. That's an example of post-zygotic isolation. So those are the types of isolation. Let's get into the types of speciation. Allopatric speciation refers to the idea of speciation that occurs as a result of some extrinsic barrier between populations. So think of geographic barriers. Geographic isolation results in a barrier to gene flow between populations. Think about if there's a large mountain separating two different species, things of that sort. So this barrier doesn't have to be complete. It simply must greatly reduce the flow of genetic material. So maybe it is a mountain, but maybe some animals are capable of getting over the mountain and some aren't. So that geographic isolation is a barrier, but it doesn't necessarily affect every single person. It just reduces the flow of that genetic material. The word allopatric, if we break that down, it comes from Greek, and allos means different, and patris means fatherland. So they're separated into two different places. So here's just an example of allopatric speciation. So a volcano erupts, and these two types of lizards, or the population of lizards, I should say, are no longer able to mate because of the volcano, the lava flow that is preventing them from crossing into each other. The next type of speciation is parapatric speciation, and this is a special kind of allopatric speciation. So parapatric is a type of allopatric. Like allopatric speciation, there is some extrinsic barrier between populations to reduce the genetic materials, but this mechanism of speciation occurs when one of the isolated populations only has a few number of individuals present. So if you remember genetic drift, think back to our previous units, acts more quickly on smaller populations. So parapatric speciation is going to drive speciation to occur more quickly because there are less individuals involved. So here's another example just of parapatric speciation, and I'm not going to read through this, waste your time, but you can pause the video and read this on your own. The next type of speciation is sympatric. And this refers to speciation that does not occur as a result of some extrinsic barrier between populations. So before sympatric speciation, the initial population would inhabit the same geographic area, but some members of a population might exploit just a new niche in the same geographic area. So some members might decide they don't really like where they're hanging out and they just move to a different place. They're not necessarily separated by any major boundary or barrier, but they just decide they don't want to be a part of that specific area. They move to a slightly different place in the same overall geographic space. So once these members go ahead and exploit a new niche or area, over time, the flow of the genetic material might be reduced between the original population and the population exploiting a new niche. So sympatric, if we break that word down, means together from syn, and patris means fatherland. So they're together in the same place, but some members just decide to move a little bit away from the other members. So here's a good example of sympatric speciation talking about naked mole rats. Another type of speciation is parapatric, and this refers to a speciation that occurs within a continuous population that has no specific extrinsic barrier to the flow of genetic material. This population does, however, not mate randomly. Individuals of a population mate with the people that are closest to them geographically rather than those that are not. So the result of this mating reduces the flow of genetic material between members of the population located in different areas. Additionally, there might be different selective pressures acting on these different geographic areas, and these conditions may likely drive divergence in the populations. So here is an example of parapatric speciation for you to read through. And that's where we're going to go ahead and stop for today. I don't want to get into the other types of isolation. I'll just leave us at speciation.